All right, so we actually didn't deal with this until the later workshop, but many of you may have gotten an email or seen on your site this dire warning about a Drupal patch and update that needs to be applied. So on Pantheon, they don't actually usually send out those email updates for just your usual set of Drupal core patches. But this one, I was reading about it, happens to be really, really, really bad. Where someone can actually take control of your database without even logging into your site. Usually, someone has to have some level of permission to be able to do the sorts of things that could really compromise your site. In this case, it actually could happen without them logging in. So this is an important update and one that we should do. So if we go to our Pantheon dashboard here, you'll see this warning that we can't pull upstream updates while Sftp connection mode is enabled. So on Pantheon, this is a little bit different than basically any other hosting setup. There are two connection modes, Sftp and Git. Sftp is what allows us to do a number of very convenient things, like being able to install modules and themes through the Drupal user interface. So for our purposes, we generally want it to be in Sftp mode. But in order to take advantage of the fact that Pantheon will push out to us these core updates, including this really crucial one, we're going to want to temporarily switch to Git. So Pantheon's kind of underlying infrastructure is designed with Git in mind, and so when you use Sftp, you have to create a commit message, which basically takes all of your changes and commits them to the Pantheon infrastructure in a way that's compatible with Git. So if we were using Git routinely to do our module installations, we'd have a commit message probably for every module that we install, which is a good thing because it allows you to do things like kind of roll back one individual module or one individual module update without losing everything you've done. Because we're using Sftp, we don't really have that granularity, and so let's just say initial configuration modules, and we'll hit commit here.
Initial what?
You can put in really whatever you want for it. I just put initial configuration modules because it was some very basic modules that we installed last week. So once you've committed your changes there, hit the Git tab here. All right, so once you've done that, you can do this, run update PHP after pulling the update, auto-resolve conflicts, and we'll hit apply updates.
I'm sorry, can you repeat all that? I'm still logging in.
Oh yeah, sure. So the first thing you want to do is put in a commit message.
Could you also repeat where the warning message was about how we need to update?
Yeah, so on your Pantheon dashboard, just when you log in and you're looking at your site, there you should see a warning message that there is a patch available. If some of you don't, I actually didn't yesterday, so it may not. Raise your hand if you did see that warning message, just out of curiosity. So maybe 2/3 of you. All right. So if you're not seeing that, I'm not quite sure what to say other than maybe it hasn't been rolled out to your site yet.
Would we see if we don't have to log in? So if we were already logged in from before?
I think I've been logged in this whole time and it's popped up for me. I'm not really sure what the difference is. Yeah.
Quinn, how did you get to the dashboard? I logged into Pantheon.
Okay. So
I also have logged into the site.
okay, so there's a couple different places that you need to log in here. You log into Pantheon and you should get something that looks like this with a bunch of different
that's
sites.
Where I'm at.
So then you click on your site, whichever site is the one that you're using here.
I'm already in the site.
So if you're in here, this is where we're configuring things. So do you see a
Sorry, how did you get from?
I
how
just
did you get,
I just clicked on the site.
I didn't
I did too, but I'm getting the blue site with the blue Drupal. I'm
Um,
going directly.
How do you leave the development page, basically?
so maybe try clicking on the name of it. Under Quinn's Thursday site here.
So that's what I'm getting.
And you're getting your site directly?
I'm going directly to the site.
All right,
Let me try it again.
who else is having trouble here?
Okay, I got it.
Yeah, because we've committed your changes, that's
Okay,
good to
sorry.
apply updates. Alright, anyone else having trouble with this? By the way, we're having an earthquake right now, so let's all. Yes, there's an exception for people in classes, so we'll say this is a safe bubble where there is no earthquake. A no earthquake drill. But yeah, that's what's going on outside. Alright, anyone else having trouble with the update? What do you got? Okay, yeah, so scroll up and then put a commit message here. Just type in whatever. Alright, commit.
Do I need to be in C?
Not yet. You want to commit this first, and then you switch to Git
Okay.
after you've committed your code.
Okay, thank you.
Alright, anyone else having trouble with the update?
So what's the thing you do that you're supposed to be an SFTP first, and then
SFTP, you commit your changes, and then you hit the Git tab, run the update. And then once you're done with that, you probably want to be able to install modules again back through the user interface. So then we're going to switch our mode back to SFTP. So everyone hit the SFTP tab once you've done your changes.
Are you supposed to be in SFTP most of the time?
Yeah, if you want to be able to, unless you know Git and are familiar with how to do that sort of code workflow, SFTP will make your life a little bit easier. You can use the interface to install modules. Yeah.
I wonder if you don't auto-resolve
Um,
in that second.
it's fine. And the reason you wouldn't want to auto-resolve the conflicts is if you've made changes to the Drupal core files, which you generally shouldn't do. But if you have for some reason, then you sort of need to negotiate that yourself and sort of figure out where the patches are, apply that to your kind of adjusted version of Drupal core, and then maybe push it yourself. All right, so everyone has the update or not, and we're back in SFTP mode. So this is not how you would manage core updates if you were hosting this basically anywhere other than Pantheon. And if it weren't for the fact that this is a really important update, I probably wouldn't even bother with going through this on Pantheon, because it is a fairly distinct system for doing it. Next week, when we talk about how to migrate your site off to another hosting environment, I'll show you how you would normally do module updates and core updates. The good news is that module updates you can do through the Drupal interface itself, just like you installed the modules. Core updates, though, you actually have to go into the server and copy over some new files. But we'll cover that next week when we're actually getting our hands into the Drupal files themselves, not mediated through the Pantheon dashboard or Drupal's own installation interface. All right, so any other questions on that so far? All right, back to our regularly scheduled program. So hit the Visit Development site and pull up your site here. And let's take a look at some of these slides. So, what this workshop will cover today, we will further discuss data modeling using an example site that we can all work through. If you have your own project in mind, you might want to try that on your own. But I think if you're not entirely comfortable with what we're doing, it could be good just to follow along with the example site, build out the example site in this workshop. And then, after class, when you're more comfortable with navigating around Drupal and setting up content types and fields, then trying your own project, just so that we're all on the same page. We're going to actually build some content types, and we may start adding some content. We ran out of time with the Wednesday session on that, so that might be at the beginning of next time. And then briefly we'll discuss blocks, which are basically chunks of content or functionality, so things like being able to log in or a list of which users are currently online, that you put somewhere concretely on a page. And when you're talking about putting things concretely on a page, it's important to talk about that in the context of themes, which are the sort of packets of code that you install that give your site a certain look and feel, and you can define the colors and fonts and all of that. That's the agenda for today. So installing modules, we did some of this last time. Does everyone have most of these installed on your site? If you want to check, you can go to your list of modules here, so just click on modules and double check here. We want to make sure that we have the administration menu, so our drop-down menu that lets us get everywhere at once. Backup and migrate. It looks like I, perhaps due to talking too much, failed to install most of these, so I will take a minute to do that. Perhaps you will need to as well. So we'll have C tools. And again, to find modules, you really want to Google this. Don't use the search on Drupal.org. So we will install that.
Do you want us also to install date, field group, link, references?
Yes. Yes. So for those of you who have installed these, let me actually just write a list of these on the board so I can set about installing them, and you can see what the lists are. So we have date, field group, link, references.
You need a better pen.
I do.
Sorry.
Automatic. No. Title. We'll leave off hundreds of others. We may get to some of them. So then C tools, Graph Auto, token, and we use.
Should we check the boxes? Like, if it's loaded but it's not checked, should we do that? Like,
Yeah. So with C tools, you'll only need, I think, just the core C tools module itself. There's like 8 modules that come with that. You won't need all of them. With C tools, you might just want to leave that unchecked and then let it automatically. Oh, thank you so much. If you try to then check the views module, it will only check those C tools modules that you need for views, which is what we're actually installing it for.
one of the, I think it was references, I guess.
Oh.
It's not checked. So
Alright, so with references, you do want all 3 of them. Reference, node reference, and user reference.
checked.
Yep.
And field group and all of those on your list should be checked, or?
Let me, this is probably fields underscore group. What are the options for field group? I think that it's just one module, that you,
Well, that's
that you
there's
check.
node reference, references, user reference, field group, and link.
yeah, so install all of those.
Well, they're not enabled. We want to enable them, right?
Yeah, install them, then enable them.
But we don't enable field group.
Enable field group, sure. Sorry?
Do we enable all the C tools?
No, you can, to only enable the ones that you need for that, just leave ctools unchecked, but then try to check the views module. And when you do that, it'll say, like, do you want to enable, like, you know, ctools and maybe another one of the modules. And that way it'll just enable the ones that you need. There's a lot of ctools ones that you aren't going to need.
So the date ones that it needed the date API and then.
On that one, it's the date API and I think date. I think those are the only two you need. You can do things
I
like.
don't have time zone settings.
Oh well, we can get to that.
Okay.
If you have more enabled than what you need, does it cause problems?
Not as such. So basically the trick with modules is that, you know, you shouldn't hesitate to install a module out of concern for having too many of them, but you do want to really only have enabled modules that you're actually using, because if you have some enabled that you're not using, you're kind of on the hook for doing the module updates on them if there's a security patch. And also if you have too many modules, and we're talking like, you know, getting into the like hundreds of modules, it can slow down your site as well. So be liberal in adding modules, but, you know, assess what you're using every so often to make sure that you just have what you need. All right, so for date, the core ones we're going to need are date and date API. I think, and date views, actually. We'll also need that, but that won't be. Date API and date views. Yeah, I'll write that on the board with my awesome new pens.
All those awesome new pens.
Well, less awesome than I thought. Let's try the other.
There's some pens further down, maybe some of those are.
Give me that.
Okay, here we go. We got a pen.
Got a pen.
We got a pen. We got a pen that works. It's like worn down to the tiniest nub, but it's a good one. All right. So those are the ones that you're gonna need. And we'll do field group, link, node reference, references, user reference, automatic node tiles. Oh, I need to install token.
Here's 3 more.
Oh, thanks. One of these is bound to work.
Automatic node tiles?
Automatic node titles, yes. I forgot to install the token module, which is a prerequisite for it. So I have to go back and do that.
Hey Quinn, suppose you try to install a module that you already installed.
It'll just tell you can't do that. Nothing terrible will happen. Nothing exciting even will happen. All right, so how are people doing on module installation? Do you still need some more time?
Can you pull up the list again?
Yes. So these are our kind of core set of modules that you should probably install on all sites, regardless of what you're doing. And then these are some modules that we're going to use for building content types. And the first 4 of these are modules that provide a certain kind of field. And we can talk about fields in a moment. They're basically, you know, fields on the content types where you can put in a certain kind of data. And automatic node titles is basically a workaround for the fact that Drupal requires that every node have a title from Drupal's point of view. It doesn't care whether it makes sense for that node to have a title in the like real world of like you and your data set, but, you know, for its internal purposes, it has to have a title. So automatic node titles is a way to placate Drupal without racking your brains about trying to figure out what an appropriate title for content that really doesn't fit that model looks like. All right, raise your hand if you need more time. Okay. In person. Is having the list up here okay? Is that right if we move on the slides? Okay. So our example site is based on a real project that I've put together a Drupal version for multiple times over the years. It's yeah, this fun historical site where a professor has gathered a bunch of quotes by the American founding fathers about one another. And there's a page in kind of a static HTML version. There's a page for every key important historical figure with a biography, and then a set of example quotes, from certain people to other people. Sometimes these quotes are like in the context of a letter. There's a date with them, and some of them are like the person just talking about him or herself. And so this is something that like would be really great to do as a Drupal site, because you could create every quote as a node with a content type. You can link it to the person who's being discussed as well as the people who are discussing the person. And then you can set up kind of a cute Facebook type timeline off of this. So here's something that we're going to be creating here. Ultimately, we have this nice grid of images of historical figures, and here's a profile of an individual person here, and then here's this timeline of people talking to other people about him. And so by the end of this workshop, we'll have done something similar with this data. So reviewing from last time, there are some data modeling considerations here as we try to figure out how to break this content down into content types. There's a question of data or metadata. So the core data that we're storing in our site is going to become the content types. And metadata, or information about that data, will become fields on those different content types, including potentially taxonomy fields, which, as we discussed last time, you can add a little bit more information to taxonomy fields than you can just a plain old text field or something like that.
I have a question about the nomenclature.
Yeah.
And when you say data, to me, if there was information about a person, but say the birth date, that could be data, or their social security number could be data. But it seems to me that what you're using data here is more of a concept, like a higher level entity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and this data versus metadata is more my own nomenclature. I think you're right that it's kind of fuzzy and less precise. I think within the context, particularly of digital humanities, it maybe makes it a little bit more. Maybe people think about things a little bit more along those terms. But like in this case, yeah, data. By data, I have in mind what are like kind of the key like. Categories, or I mean, I'm hard pressed to think of a word that doesn't also mean something else in other contexts too, or like entities, or what are the things that you're trying to capture information about?
I guess it would be like a class and object-oriented programming for people that are
Yeah.
familiar with that.
So yeah, a class and object-oriented programming is a good parallel here. So yeah, does anyone else have questions about the terminology here, or kind of what we're
Can you give an
getting at?
example using like a real sentence?
So with our example site, where I'm ultimately going with this here is that in our example we have information about the people, and so the people are going to be a content type, and then things like George Washington's birthday and the day that he died, and other details of his biography. That's information about George Washington, and those are going to be fields within our person content type.
That's metadata.
Yeah, that's at least the way that I'm framing it here. And similarly with the quotes, each quote we're going to have a content type for that, and then information about the quote, who said it, who's it about, and so forth. Those are going to be fields. Although I'm I'm sort of giving away the end point of where I'm sort of gradually going to lead you down. So apologies for spoiling the punchline, but I think it will make things a little bit clearer. So here we have again the question of like taxonomy or content type for certain fields. Let's say, for instance, we want to store information about where the founding fathers attended university. And the question is, how are we going to store the information about those universities? Are we going to have a content type for universities that talks about maybe a paragraph about the history of the university, its geographic location, who the president of the university was at that time? Well, in this case, it's not really the focus of our data set. We might want to capture the information about the universities they attended, but we don't actually care all that much about the universities. That's not kind of the core information that we're trying to capture with this site. So in that case, it might make sense to store information about universities as a taxonomy. So we could have a list of universities that the different founding fathers attended. We can use a field to point to those universities. We can either allow or not allow people to add new universities to the list. And if we wanted to add a little bit more information about universities, to be able to say, put together a map of all the places that the founding fathers attended university, we could add some geographic coordinates to the taxonomy term for each individual university, but we don't have to go kind of to the full extent of creating a content type and treating it on the same level of importance as person or quote. Is that
one point? I think we
Yeah.
covered a lot of this last time. I think we got ahead maybe.
Okay.
So,
Thank you. In that case, are there any questions about this stuff? Or perhaps we'll get to questions as we actually work through this example then. All right, thank you. All right, so here we have our actual data. Data as I'm using it again in a less precise sense. So our first example, we have a reference to Alexander Hamilton in a letter between two different parties. So we have Millington Smith writing to Nathan Dane on June 28th, 1788. Hamilton is a champion, he speaks frequently, very long, very vehemently, probably has much to say, not very applicable to the subject. This is why I love this example too. There's a lot of really fun kind of snarky quotes about important historical figures here. So we have this quote, that's good. Here's another example in a document that doesn't have a specific recipient. So that's good to keep in mind. And then here we have a third example where Abigail Adams is talking about herself to John Adams on a certain date. So if we're going to create a content type for a quote, we need to keep all of this stuff in mind. Based on just this first example, we might say, okay, a quote needs to have a source, it needs to have a recipient, it needs to have a date, and it needs to have a subject. But when we look at some of the other information here, we see that not all of them have a recipient. Sometimes there's also a document name that's associated with it, like this memoirs. And sometimes we just have the subject is the same as the speaker. So these are all things to keep in mind as we're building our content types. So here's an example biography from the site as it currently exists. And as you might notice, it's kind of written almost like in bullet point style here. And this is something that in some ways is very tempting to break down into a bunch of different fields. So you could have a birth location field, for instance. You could have a field for when he came to America. You could indicate where he went to college. You could indicate a field for when he went to college. Maybe there's some way to capture this. Wrote pamphlets and newspaper essays favoring independence as activities or something like that. You could talk about, who he served in the military with, who he married, and all of these could be different fields. And when your data looks like this, it's really tempting to try to capture absolutely everything, down to, maybe a field for was he a lawyer or not. Maybe we care about, everything that lawyers said, versus other people. Do lawyers speak more carefully about other historical figures or not? There's a bunch of different research questions that we could answer if we encoded all of this stuff in fields, but it would also take, forever to actually do that data entry work. And it's a lot faster to just have, one big text box and dump this data in there and say, all right, this is just going to be a text field. This will be, just human readable. We won't make it, machine actionable in any way. And kind of where you draw the line between, just having a text box and like letting people read it and breaking this data up into fields really depends on what questions you're trying to ask and what's important to you and how much time you have for entering the data and how many student assistants you might have. So anyone have questions on this so far? Yeah.
I looked through all of these dates and I think timeline.
Yeah, so
And one of the things you have talked about is timeline, so I'm wondering if this is like pasteable into some kind of timeline.
So that's a good question, whether this would be pasteable into a timeline. And I think what we need to do here is to kind of separate out the storage of the data from the visualization of the data. There are modules in Drupal that will let you generate timelines, but they need to pull from somewhere. And so you could actually set up your site a little bit differently than we've talked about so far and have, person be a content type. You could have quote be a content type. And you could also have maybe some sort of amorphous event being a content type that could have pointers to the people who were involved in it, and then have a date.
Because I guess I look at this list and I see almost list,
Mm-hmm.
and I see year, and then you could like organize something on year and just have it, spit out something based upon the list of all the different years.
Yeah. So then it's a question of where does it make sense to store that data? So if a timeline, if you want to be able to have a timeline of like all the important events in the lives of the people within your database, that's definitely something that you would want to consider, and you want to figure out a way to store all of this, and maybe something general like event, and you could have a category for different kinds of events. One category for like life and death related things, one category for military type events, major milestones, like career milestones and so forth. You could create a content type like that. As it happens in this particular project, this mostly is just an artifact of like how they happen to write the bibliography. Like, I don't think anyone working on this project really is that interested in like generating a timeline from the events. This is more the biographies are more to provide context for the quotes rather than being kind of the core of the project itself. But if the project was a little bit different and that timeline were important, then definitely maybe having that event content type and storing the dates that way and associating it with a person might be the way to go. So again, your content types and your fields really all depend on your specific project. So here's what we would need for like a bare bones minimal content type. Our person content type could just be the name, and Drupal has a title field that's required for all content types, and we could rename the title field to be name. And the biography, we can just rename the default body field and put all the text in there, and there you would have it. With a quote, similarly, the title could be the from, to, and so forth, and then you could put the body of the quote into the body field. And this is the simplest way that you could create a content type, probably the fastest from the perspective of data entry, but what you get out of it is likewise extremely limited. So what you get basically is a Drupal version of the static HTML pages that you get out of this to begin with. If we don't have fields that specifically call out what the dates are, then we can't do anything with those dates. Like they're text like any other text, We can't turn them into a timeline. We can't order the quotes by date if we don't kind of call out the data in a field that's specifically a date field. Likewise, with associations between persons and quotes, if we put all this information in the title, then we, as literate people, can read the quotes and see, all right, well, this has to do with Alexander Hamilton, and it was written by Mellington Smith. But there's no way for Drupal to be able to associate the people with the quotes and be able to say, draw together all of the quotes about a certain person unless we have a field that calls that out. So while this is appealing in the ease of data entry, we're going to need to make it more sophisticated if we want to do anything interesting with it. So let's start creating some content types, and we can work out the details of the fields from there. So the overall workflow for creating content types is we'll add the new content type, we configure the settings, we add new fields, configure the display, and then we create some dummy content to try it out. So let's get started. Let's see. Let's get started with the person content type. So if we go back over to our site, we will go to structure, content types, add content type. And we will call this person. And you can give it a description if you want, for the sake of your site being usable by other people and your kind of internal documentation. If there'll be more than one person adding content to the site, it's probably worthwhile putting in a description. We'll say biographical information about historical figure. We'll go with that. If you have installed and enabled the automatic node titles module, you'll see this automatic title generation thing down here. For the time being, we will leave that as disabled. And actually for person, I think we'll probably leave it disabled in general. But we'll get to that when we get to the quotes. So under submission form settings, we'll just work our way through the settings here. The title field label. In this case, we have some information about the person that is a pretty good match for what Drupal expects in its titles, and that is the name. So we will rename this to be name. Moving along here under publishing options. So by default, it's published. We might want to change this if, for instance, we have a site that has already launched publicly, so people are viewing the site, and we have, say, student assistants entering data, but you want to make sure that you review the data before it actually goes up publicly on the site. In which case, you might want the default option to be unpublished, and then you can go back in and review all the unpublished nodes, make sure they're correct, and then publish them individually once that's been covered. The other thing that's sticky at the top of lists is not really relevant unless you're using Drupal's default homepage, which we won't be using. Under create a new revision, this can be a useful thing if you have data that multiple people will be editing and you want to be able to track each version with the changes that are made each time someone edits it. There's also modules that you can install that allow you to do sort of a Wikipedia-like compare versions between different revisions. So yeah, especially if you have a large team doing data entry, it's useful to have create a new revision. Under display settings, displaying author and date information only really makes sense for things like blog posts or things where the time when something was written and the author who did the writing are really important part of things. In most cases, for these kinds of sites, what we're going to be entering is information from our big data set, and we don't really care who it is who entered it and when that happened. So we will uncheck this display author and date information. all of the stuff is being stored on the back end though, so it's not like you won't be able to see who did the data entry. It just won't be displayed prominently as part of the nodes we create. Under comment settings, we will just say closed. We don't actually need people's opinions on the founding fathers on our site. If we don't need comments anywhere, then you can just disable the comments module on the modules page, and then you're good. Unfortunately, if you need comments anywhere, if you need comments on one content type, say you have a project blog and you want comments on that, you have to enable the comments module and then close comments on it for every single other content type. Even if you just need it one place and you don't need it in 20 other content types, you have to disable it for each one. Kind of a pain, but there you go. Menu settings, each node can be added to a menu. So you could potentially, if you had a fairly short list, you could have a list of founding fathers that could be a drop-down list, and people could sort of see all the options. This will basically say which menus can you choose from when you're trying to add a node that you create to a menu. Does anyone have any questions about all of this so far?
Do we want to keep them on the main menu?
That's fine. I mean, just because this is enabled doesn't mean that they'll automatically be added to it. You do actually manually have to add them to a menu. This just sort of says what are the options if you do add them manually, like where are the places you can put them. There are modules that will automatically add things to menus, but this should be fine for now. Any other questions?
For the promoted front page, even though that wasn't relevant, would it be good to disable it just so it doesn't do something on the back end?
Yeah, we could do that. It doesn't really matter, but yeah, better to have things disabled, I suppose, than enabled. All right. Any other questions before we dive into fields? All right. So if we were done, and if we had a very simple content type that just had like a title and a body field, we could just save it and be done. But as we discussed, we're going to want to add some fields to this content type, so we will hit save and add fields. All right. So what we have so far, we have we have the name, and we have body. We talked before about wanting to change the name of body to something that's more reflective of what we're actually going to put in there. So let's just hit the edit link next to body, and we will call it Biography. If you want to provide some help text, explaining, where student assistants should go to find the biography for each person, you can put that in there. It'll appear as kind of light gray text underneath the fields, exactly like you see here. Besides this, the default values are fine. By default, when you create a content type, there's a body field that is added. You don't have to keep it there. You can delete it, and it won't have any terrible consequences for your site. And if in the future you need to, re-add it, you can't re-add the body field. Well, I guess you could add it as an existing field. But you could also create a long text and summary, or just a simple long text field, and that will have the same functionality. So let's look at some of the other fields that we might want to add. So person, we're already almost halfway through what we need to do here. We have our name, which is a title. We have biography, which is the renamed body field. We want to add a birth date and a death date. So let's look at that here. So we're going to add a new field. We will call it birth. And under field type, we will select date. There are other options for date, such as ISO format and Unix timestamp. In almost all cases, you'll want to go with date. Does anyone not see the date field? All right. Well done. Everyone has successfully then installed the date module. It usually happens that someone forgets to add that one and it doesn't show up. But are you getting ahead over there?
That is kind of pop-up calendar.
Oh.
Install
Form
something
element
else.
to edit the data.
Oh, so if you've enabled the pop-up calendar module, there is a pop-up calendar option. Honestly, in most cases, I just go for the boring text field with historical dates, because if you're using the pop-up calendar, I think you can like maybe define a start and end date for the pop-up calendar, but there's the risk of doing a lot of scrolling, like past months and months and months and months. If your content is more recent and you're setting up like an event that's going to happen in the near future, then the pop-up date might be a nice, user-friendly way to enter dates. Less so for historical dates, perhaps. So, yeah.
You select text field for date, does it put some constraints on the format that you can enter into the...
We will get to that on the next page. Alright, so we will save this here. And alright, so for starters, you want to define what the date attributes are that you want to collect. We don't know his birthday down to the hour and the minute, so we're just going to uncheck those. Now, one of the tricky things about date is that when you use the date module and you're setting this up, it basically expects that all of your dates are going to be of the same granularity. So these are now, if you're going to create a date, it has to have a year, a month, and a day. And in a lot of cases, especially when you're working with historical data, you're not going to have that for all of your data info. Sometimes you're only going to have a year, or maybe a year and a month, or maybe you have something even more vague, like spring 1772. And so there is, as we often say with Drupal, there's a module for that, and the module is called partial date, and it's not terribly actively maintained. It's a little bit buggy. You can't import, say, from like a spreadsheet into Drupal using partial date, whereas you can with the standard date field. But if you have a lot of fuzzy dates or things with different granularity, it's worth keeping in mind as an option. We don't want to collect an end date. Probably don't really need to cache
So you're saying
dates.
whatever we click here affects every date
Affects every date in the birth field.
in the birth field?
Yes.
Okay,
So-
but not like death.
No. So death will have its own
Okay,
configuration
but
that
just
is
birth.
yes.
All the births have to have
All
the
the
same
births have to
form.
be a year, month, day when we do this, and we can configure death to be something else entirely.
Death has its own configuration.
Yes, death has its own configuration. The quotable Drupal, right there.
Do the dates need to be entered in a certain format?
We'll get to that on the next page. Yes, no, that's a good question, and the next page is where we will define this. I think, yes. All right, there we go. All right, I knew it was part of this. All right, so we have our label here. Now, required field. We can set this for all of the fields that we create, whether it should be a required field. Based on the data that we were looking at earlier, should this be a required field?
No.
No, exactly. Not all of our quotes have a date associated with them. And again, this is just one of those things where you have to know your data set and you have to know what it looks like and be able to configure your content types to accommodate that. So it's not going to be a required field. Help text, if you want to put some in there.
Wait, this is the date for the person, right?
This is the birth for the person.
Yeah, right.
Oh, you're right. I'm thinking quotes. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Birth. All right, well, it's still a good question. Should the birth field be required? Maybe. I think all of our figures do have known birth dates, although if to be fair, the person we use as our example is Alexander Hamilton, and there are 2 possible birth dates for him. So if we wanted to be very precise about this, we might need to configure things a little bit differently so that you could maybe have an optional or multiple values, or you might want to have 2 birth date fields with your standard birth field and a alternative birth date field. We're not going to get so far into the weeds with this specific data set, but I mean, these are considerations that you need to keep in mind with your actual data. And so for birth, let's say it's a required field. If they're alive and they're saying snarky things about founding fathers, then they must have been born at some point, and we're going to say that for this data set, we can find birth dates for all the people we're going to try to create. All right, so as we scroll down, toggle down the more settings and values here, and this actually gets into some important stuff that you should keep in mind. So the date entry is exactly what you've been asking about with the date entry options and what format that it needs to be entered in. So what you define here is the order and the format that people will need to use to put in data using today's date as an example. Yeah?
I'm confused why the timestamp is there when we specified that we didn't need the hours per minute.
Because Drupal isn't smart enough to know what you've already done. Basically, this is a standard set of things. The timestamp won't be showing up when people enter data, and you won't have to worry about that part. But yeah, that is a little bit annoying, and
It just made me go back to confirm that I had indeed deselected it, and then
yeah. So if you want to do a sanity check, you can actually just scroll down, and it will this information that you configured earlier is now at the bottom of the screen. So we can see, all right, we are just capturing year, month, day, and we can ignore what it's doing here with the timestamp.
And is this just for the convenience of the person entering it? Like, if you wanted to suddenly look at something by the year, you could bring that up that way.
Yeah,
so it doesn't matter really.
The stuff is stored kind of in a good structured format on the back end, and so you can display it in any format you want in the future. You can sort it in any way you want in the future. This is just how they have to enter it, and they do with a text field. They do actually have to enter it in this format. So if I select this and someone types in October, the full name of the month, 16. It'll reject that as not a valid value. So there is some importance to it, but you have to pick one. But it doesn't have any sort of lasting significance.
So do you have to tell the user how to enter it?
Well, it will. When we create this field, we can go take a look at what it's going to look like. I think it shall have instructions for how you have to enter the date.
You don't have to manually put it in the help test.
I don't think so. All right, so we'll go with this. Under advanced settings, that doesn't apply to text field, I think. Here's another important one that's buried pretty deep in there, default values. So by default, I think date is really designed more for modern occurrences, and by default it will put in the date now if you don't put in any data. So if you create a founding father person node and you don't happen to know their birth date and you want to go back and add that later, and you leave it blank, it will put in today's date, which is really not what you want. So you want to change this to no default value.
But won't we get an error message because we made it a required field?
No, because it will. Oh, will you in this case? That's a good question.
I mean, that's the downside of making things required because
it'll throw these errors.
If you do put a modern date, then you almost know. Then you get a date in there, and then you know that it's.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. That you have this conflict here, where it's almost better to have it be left blank and not and not make it be required, so that you can tell where the gaps in your data are. So that's in light of that, I have been convinced that we should not make this a required field. Again, though, it all depends on your project and your workflow and what you want to maybe enforce on the data entry side versus on the data cleanup side. There's often no one right answer. All right.
Can you go back, let's say you do this, and then you're like, oh my god, everybody, we didn't change the default value to no value, and now the today's date's always showing up. Can you go back after the fact and change it?
You can
so that it won't
go back after the fact, and yeah, so it won't affect people in the future, but that won't fix the ones that were left blank and now have the modern dates.
Okay.
All right.
What does relative mean in relation to dates?
Oh, relative. So that's a go, or from now, which and so you can. So relative date value. you can do this. So you can have the default value be like 90 days after the creation date, or yeah, +1 Saturday, which I've never had a use for exactly, but perhaps someone might. We're going to say no default value there. All right, a number of values is going to be 1 according to our data model. You can only be born once, and Drupal will enforce that for us. So we've slogged our way through a date setting or date field setting. We're going to save these settings here. And now, just for kicks, let's go take a look at what this would look like if we were to create some content with it. So we would go to Content, Add Content. You should see Person there. If anyone doesn't see Person there, it means that your administration toolbar thing has cached the old values and hasn't updated with the new content type. So in general, if you've made a change, especially a configuration change, and you're not seeing it reflected on your site, you can go over to this nice house thing on the left and hit Flush All Caches. And Flush All Caches is like, you know, the whole like close and reopen your browser or turn it off and turn it on again with Drupal. It's like the first first line of debugging for Drupal. If things are acting a little bit inexplicably wonky, try clearing the cache, and sometimes that just fixes things.
It did.
But how do you get that round icon, which you could just use for flushing cache?
This?
So you don't go through a menu?
I just use the admin drop-down menu
Okay.
up here. So it's part of the admin menu module.
Okay.
Hover over the house, flush all caches, and that takes care of that. All right, so we're gonna go to content. We're gonna add content and person, and we'll see what this looks like. We have our name, and this is a required field because it's Drupal's title field, and like I mentioned, Drupal really has a thing about titles. You know, every node has to have a title unless you find a way to work around that, as we will do with the quotes further on. Biography, we can put some data in there. Birth, all right, and it says our format right here. So hopefully people will follow that. Looking pretty good. So any questions about this so far? All right, let's go back to our content type. We're going to go to Structure, Content Type, Person, Manage Fields, and you can see here, you know, how having the administration menu is starting to pay off in terms of being able to go, you know, 4 layers deep without, you know, having to click once.
I'm sorry, how'd you get there?
Okay, you go to Structure, Content Types, Person, Manage Fields.
So if I see things like body, it means it hasn't, like, then I should flush.
Did you rename body to biography?
It did. I don't have birth either, which.
Oh.
But it's showing here.
Oh, okay. All right. So yeah, try flushing the cache and then see if it shows up on your menu.
Yeah, because it's in the thing when I was trying to see what it looks like when you enter.
Yeah. So just hit flush all caches and then see if it shows up in your.
Yeah, now it's fine.
All right. Great. All right. So we'll go over to manage fields. And let's configure another date field for death using basically the same configuration. So we're going to do the same thing. We don't know when exactly it happened. We're just going to do year, month, date. We'll save our settings. We'll not make it a required field. But we do need to toggle down more settings and values. Uh-oh, something bad happened? Oh, sorry. All right, so we've
I added death.
All right, you added death.
Then now where do I go?
Where did you add death?
Well, it says death has been added. I don't know.
Oh, you added a content type death.
Oh,
Okay,
okay. I didn't know
this is a common problem.
Okay.
Um,
Woo, now I'm like.
All right. So we go to structure, content types,
Structure, content type,
prison,
person.
manage fields.
Okay.
All right, click on that. And now we're going to add a new field called death filter. And then there'll be a date field. There we go.
Is there any way just to copy the birth field and then just change it to death as the label and call it good?
Is there a way to?
Button about-
There are some places in Drupal where you can clone other things. There might be a module for that, but I don't actually think there's a way just in core Drupal to clone a field. That's a good question though. All right, so here we are in death. More settings and values. We want the default date to be no default value. We have one death, and we'll save that. All right. Does anyone need more time configuring death? Okay. So another thing that you can do if you don't like the order that things are stacking up in is if you can hover over this plus sign thing on the left-hand side, you can drag fields up or down to rearrange them. So we'll put birth and death in that order, and then biography. The only trick with this is when you've rearranged things, you want to make sure you actually scroll down and save it, rather than like going from there to create a new field or editing things. Otherwise, your work rearranging the fields won't actually stick. All right. So another field that we want to add is an image field to capture the image of the person. And in this case, there already is an image field that's been automatically configured by Drupal as part of the article content type that Drupal just creates by default. And so rather than creating a whole new field, let's just use that field as part of our person content type. So we will, under existing, add existing field here, we will choose field image. We'll select that, and then we will hit save. Alright, so you can add some help text. You can add a default image if you want that will be used if no image is uploaded in that field. Here's some allowed file extensions. I think this may be the only ones that it likes. For image fields, you can't. There's not a lot of flexibility in what you can add with file extensions. There's also a field module that lets you upload any kind of file, and then you can basically choose any kind of file extension for it. For if there's any librarians in the crowd, JPEG 2000 isn't actually supported in Drupal by default. So that question did come up in the other workshop. People are using the Jatoka image server.
Does PDF file count as image?
No, that counts as I think it treats it as like a document, and so you want to convert. Yeah, you'd want to either convert PDFs to something else, or you'd use a file field rather than an image field. And it's actually kind of important that there is a specific image field because, as we'll get to next time, Drupal can do all sorts of manipulations on images to be able to scale them and crop them and do watermarks on them and color them purple and like do all sorts of transformations to it. Which can potentially save you a lot of time and work in doing image prep yourself before you upload it to Drupal. But for that to work, it needs to be sort of a defined range of file types. If you want the images you upload to be part of a subdirectory so that you know that like everything in the people directory is pictures of people, you can put that here. Well, we'll do that. Sure. Why not? We'll,
Question. So when
yeah.
we add this person type, then later on if we're adding another content type, will it be an option for person in the existing content types?
So you can't kind of include a whole content type in another content type, but you can include fields from the other content type. So if we were creating, let's say we wanted to create another content type for zombies, parallel to people, then as you're doing the configuring the fields, you would have access to like the birth field and the death field as you configured them for the person, that you could add to your zombie content type. Does that answer the question?
So, and the images appear automatically because it's already been created, or do you?
Well, it'd be just like what we're doing right now. So this field that we're configuring right now is a field that already exists in the database as the image field, and some of the settings, like these allowed file extensions, were already like pre-populated in the configuration. So I think the help text can be different for the same field in different content types, but some of the other settings, like for instance the fact that we're only capturing year, month, and day for birth and death, that would be consistent regardless of where we use it. Does that?
I'm not sure. Just go on. It'll probably be explained later.
Okay. All right. So we've done this preview image style. We'll get into image styles next time, but you can basically choose how the image is going to appear on the node. Preview, we're going to say one image, public files, don't have a default image, so we'll save our settings here. All right, so the last thing that we're going to want to do is, according to our list here, a way to indicate whether this is a key historical person or a minor figure, because how we treat people in the database to some extent is going to vary depending on whether they're an important person who there are quotes about, or whether it's someone who like just happens to be in the database because they once said something about George Washington. So let's create a field to be able to capture that information. We will use a boolean, which will be a single on-off checkbox, and we will say minor figure. And we'll save that. All right. This is, I believe, the way that it's stored in the database. So we'll leave this just as its default settings. And I think, no, we will want this. So let's say is a minor historical figure. We'll use that for our on value. All right, and let's save our settings. All right, so let's go back and we'll go to our content, add content person, and see how this looks.
So, just so I'm clear on the on value, off value, that's the way it's stored. It's not stored as 0, 1.
It's also how it displays, which is
how it's stored and how it's displayed.
Yeah.
Isn't that really inefficient? Because if you have a lot of data instances, then it's storing that on string, and all you need is a boolean.
So I mean, what you could do is you could change the label if you wanted maybe to be able to accommodate it that way. I mean, the issue is sort of how it appears here. I mean, you're right. It is inefficient from a database point of view to like store that for, you know, if you had a lot of data. But from a user interface perspective, it looks better than trying to like configure a label and having a checkbox that like has a blank spot next to it. I mean, there are other ways you could get around it by using like a select list. You could do like a toggle down for that. There's nothing all that special about using the Boolean field versus like a text list or something for that. There's different ways of doing it. So if we go here and look at what our person looks like at this point, we have our name, we have our birth, we have our death, our biography, our image, and this checkbox for is a minor historical figure, which we can use to indicate which people are less important than other people. All right, other questions about the person content type? All right, then let's move on to the quote content type. We're going to create a new content type for a quote. We're going to go to structure, content types, add content type. We'll call this quote. Oh, we're going to go to structure, content types, add content type. In this case, we are actually going to want to use the automatic title generation, but we're not going to be able to use it yet because we need to create some fields before we can apply them in this context. So we'll say disabled for now, but we'll get back to this. Submission form setting, we'll leave the title field label as title. As I mentioned, we're actually going to do something kind of tricky and hide the title later on, so it doesn't really matter what it's called. Publishing options, we'll say published.
Which one you
Oh.
turned, you disable or something?
Automatic title generation. So by default, it's disabled. So
Which module did that come from?
the automatic node titles module. So if you don't have that one installed, grab a second and install that one because we'll be using it shortly. Publishing options, we'll say publish, create new revision. Display settings, we don't need to display author and date information. Comment settings, we'll close. All right. So now we're going to save and add fields. So let's look at our list here. So we want our body to be called quote. So let's take our body field and edit it and call it quote. All right. So next we want a field for subject. That's the person that's being talked about. And to do that in a way that connects it directly to the person who's stored in the database, we are going to use a node reference field. So if you haven't installed references, and specifically the node reference submodule, now would be an excellent time to do that. So we're going to say this is the subject. The field type is going to be node reference. And there's a couple different widget options. There's checkboxes, radio buttons. There's select list. But both of these get really cumbersome pretty fast if you have a lot of data in your database. So you probably are going to want autocomplete text field to do that. So let's use these settings and save. And so here we're defining what different content types we can point to for this field. In this case, what we want it to be is person. because we want this to be a pointer to a person in the database. You can choose more than one depending on your project and its needs. But in this case, it's always going to be a quote about a person who exists in our database, so we'll keep it there. If you want to do a more sophisticated selection, you can use the views module, which is basically this user interface for SQL to define a more precise set of things. But in most cases, just choosing a content type is probably sufficient. If we scroll down on the next configuration screen, Autocomplete Matching contains, that will basically use the string that the person types and look for it anywhere in the title of the different person nodes. This does cause problems if you have thousands of nodes, and it may be a little bit counterintuitive. Maybe if someone types AL and it pulls up some nodes that have like AL somewhere in the middle of the text, so you might want to switch that to starts with, or not. I mean, in this case, because we're searching in the full name, maybe someone will be typing in the person's first name and someone else will start by typing in the person's last name, and so contains might be useful in that case because it will pull it up kind of regardless of what the person puts in. So we will say one value.
I missed how you got to that.
So did you create a node reference field?
Yes.
And then on the next page you select the content type that you can reference?
It's saved.
I didn't say it. I saved it.
Let me see where you're at.
I see field groups.
Alright, scroll up. Okay, so you want to hit it.
Oh.
So now we'll get through that. Yeah.
All right. Anyone else with questions on this one?
Sorry, I had
Yeah.
labeled a node.
Oh, okay.
Go back to slide.
Yeah. So what we do is create a new field.
Oh, subject. Okay.
Yeah, field, subject, node reference, and then you want it to be a pointer to the person content type. That'll be on the next configuration screen once you save it.
I'm sorry, what?
Oh, so this is on your quote.
Did you create quote content type? Yes. Okay.
I
Will
like
it contain-
oh,
do you want this one first? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, otherwise it has to be like the very beginning of that.
And then
Okay. Save settings.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So in addition to subject, we want to create some more node reference fields here. We want also source and recipient, and I will use my marker that works to write these on the board so we can all refer to them while I'm configuring them too. So we want subject, source, recipient. These are all node reference to the person content type. And then we also want a date field. So we'll work through these here. And yeah, this is definitely a case where it would be nice to be able to clone an existing field because we're going to just set these up all the same way.
The source is pointing to
Person. These should all go to the person content type. Sorry, yeah, you're. Oh, no problem. Yeah, no, it's a little hard to see.
When you're on the manage fields
Mhm.
page, isn't there on the very bottom there's a little clone option?
Is there?
If you right there in the very bottom. System bottom.
Oh, these are cloning field
Oh,
groups.
so
Yeah. No, so close.
yeah, so-
And yet not quite.
And the size of the text field is the number of characters.
Size of the text field is like literally how long on the screen the text field is. It doesn't actually have anything to do with how many characters can be stored there, because it's a pointer to another node. And so what that fundamentally gets to is like how long titles are allowed to be in Drupal, which I believe is 255 characters by default. But it's really like how long the little like box is when you type things in the autocomplete. I find the default to be pretty reasonable. Should be person. All right. So then we'll add another date field. We'll just call it date.
Say what you're doing as you're doing it, so that as we're looking at our computer, we can follow along with what you're doing.
Yeah. So with I basically just created the subject, source, and recipient fields just the same way that we walk through the subject field together. You know, it's a node reference field. It goes to the person content type. I stuck with the default values. You know, one value uses the autocomplete kind of contained anywhere thing. So then after creating those three, I'm adding a date field that's called date, and just basically setting that one up the same way we set up birth and death here. So date entry options, we'll stick with what it provides by default. Default date will
So
be.
if we say it has to have month and year, then you're gonna have to, it has to have all of those, because we didn't do that partial dates thing?
Yeah. So you might, depending on what the data is, and let me pull
We can
this.
add a custom format that would have just year and
So if you just want it to be year, you can do that, and if you just want it to be year and month, you can do that. And the way that you do that is through these date attributes to collect thing. Note though that this, I believe, you can only change before you've added any data to the database. Once you've started putting in dates, then you're kind of stuck with this. So the problem comes up not when you only want years or you only want year and month date, but like when you have dates of different granularity. You have some that are just year, some are year and month. Then you have to look at an option like the partial dates module to be able to accommodate that.
And that would just be a different type, right? Partial date would be a type?
It would be a different field type, I think, than the date module. Are people still working on configuring these fields? I'm happy to quickly try to install partial date if you're curious what it looks like. I don't want to get too far off base.
I'm just seeing more of the regular content scope, so I want to see the references between content types.
Okay.
Views and stuff.
So yeah, once we've gotten these dates set up, there's what we can do is like we did before to sort of preview this. Go to content, add content, quote, and we see title. Oh, we're gonna have to deal with that title, but we'll get to that next. Quote. This will be the text of the quote itself. Subject, source, recipient. All of these are going to be autocomplete, and unfortunately, right now, they're not going to work because we have no person nodes created. So, according to the way this is laid out, you can't reference something that doesn't exist already. So first you have to go in, create some person nodes, and then you can create your quotes that involve those people. This is actually kind of a pain potentially when it comes to data entry. You may have some people who are focusing on quotes, some people who are creating person nodes, and you have to like sync up their work fairly precisely for them to not run into this problem where people who they need to reference aren't already in the system. So there is actually a module called node ref auto create that will allow you to enter new nodes, basically reference things that don't yet exist, and what it does is it creates an empty node for that thing that you reference. If you have any mandatory fields as part of the content type, so for instance, if we made birth date mandatory and we were using the node ref auto create with this in order to enter people who hadn't already been entered, as soon as someone entered, went in to edit the newly created person, an error message would come up saying like, you have to enter a birth date. But it doesn't actually inhibit you from creating these empty nodes, at least the first time, to be able to facilitate your data entry that way. So just for kicks, let's use that module. Let's go to modules, install new module. There we go. Auto create node reference. No. Node ref create is the one you want. And we will copy this link. We'll paste it in here. Install that. And enable newly added modules. It's node ref create is how it's showing up.
Is it the auto?
Is it auto create node reference
Or
node reference auto hyphen create or
Node ref create. So if you go to project/node ref create.
How do you get the URL when you're doing that? I'm getting downloads.
Oh, so what I'm doing is control click.
Oh, okay.
Node ref create. And even though it has this longer title, node reference create here on your modules page, it actually uses the same name as the URL path on Drupal.org. You get node ref create down here. So once you've enabled that, we can go back to our quote content type and manage the fields for that. And if we click on widget for one of our node reference fields, there'll be a new, but there should be, oh, because I didn't enable it. Here we go. Now then, as I was saying, if we go back to quote manage fields, we'll go to subject. Yeah. We should be able to choose autocomplete text field with create. Should be a new option once you've enabled that. Sorry, so if you go back to your list of fields, this field?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is structure, content types, your content type, manage fields. We'll take you here. Or whichever content type you're doing. So in this case, it's quote. So structure, content types, quote, manage fields. any of your node reference fields, we'll click on whatever the text is under widget, which should be autocomplete text field. And this will take you to a page where you can choose a different widget type. You should have the option autocomplete text field with create. Yeah, so click on autocomplete text field, and yeah, it's not totally obvious that clicking on that would take you to a configuration screen, but yeah, no, it's kind of wonky. So we'll once again click on our widget, set these all to autocomplete text field with create.
Well, actually, I don't really know what's the difference.
So there's autocomplete text field, which is what you have by default. And then if you've enabled the node ref create module, you can do the autocomplete text field with create, and that will allow you to add new, yeah. Yes.
Quinn, if your data was going to be a set of options, predefined,
Mm-hmm.
would you have a particular setting at this point? Like if it was location and you say you had a list of states.
Okay.
And it
Could
was
be any others
So with
than that list.
right.
Okay.
So with that, if it was like a list of states, you'd probably want to use create a vocabulary and use a term reference field that to that predefined list of things. So you unless states are really important like things in your database and you want to have like what the state flower is, what the state songbird is.
Suppose it was going to be just this or that state.
With that, what you'd want to do is you'd want to create a vocabulary, and so to do that, we don't need it in this case here, but I can show you quickly how to do that. You would go to Structure, Taxonomy, Add Vocabulary. We would say states, and then what we can do is we can add terms. So we have, Washington. We can create California, and so on. And then so we'd populate this vocabulary with the terms, with all the terms that we want to use, all of our states, and then back on our content type, we could create a term reference field.
Okay.
And then, we'll say state. And you could do checkboxes or radio buttons, a select list, or autocomplete from that. And you would specify which vocabulary, in this case it would be states.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we try out our new awesome auto create powers here? All right, so let's go to content, add content, quote. Oh, our title. We still need to deal with our title. All right, we'll get to that. So our quote, we'll put the text here. Put in whatever quote you like. Our subject will be, we'll say, this will be Alexander Hamilton by George Washington. And you'll notice that nothing is coming through on the autocomplete, but that's okay. That's what we expect. We haven't created any person nodes. It's looking for person nodes. It's all right. So our date, we'll say 7/4/1992. Again, I'm just making up this data here. We'll leave the recipient blank, and let's see what happens if. Well, actually, we have to put something in the title. And in our title for now, we'll put in test quote, but we'll see how this changes once we use the automatic node titles. So we'll call it test quote, put in an example quote. Subject will be Alexander Hamilton. Source will be George Washington. Put in an arbitrary date. And we will save it and see what happens. All right, so we have a test quote. And we actually have links to our person nodes. And as you can see, there's no data here, but that's okay. It did create them, and we can fill in this information later. If you want to be able to see later on all of the content that you've created on your site through one means or another, all you have to do is click on this top level content, and there you go. We not only have the quote that we created, but we have the 2-person nodes that we created by means of the node ref autocreate, which we can then go in and edit.
So why is George Washington new but not Alexander Hamilton?
I don't know. It was the second one we entered. I'm actually not sure what dictates like what Drupal considers new or not.
It's because you clicked it open, right?
Yeah, it could be because I've looked at it. But maybe that is what it is. If we, oh, there we go. Maybe that is like the fact of my having viewed it was what changed that. You know, I can learn things about Drupal too. All right, so there's one more thing we want to configure on our content type here. Let's go back to quote and just not go into manage fields. We'll just click on quote by itself. And we want to do automatic title generation, because you know there's no good data that really matches what Drupal wants in a title here. So let's say that we will automatically generate the title and hide the title field. And for pattern for title, first click in this box. And it seems a little bit silly to click in a box and not type in it, but what we can do here below is pull in tokens, which are basically placeholders for data. And if we've clicked in the box once before we get into this token list, it will actually let us automatically pull the tokens into that box. So let's click on nodes. And what we want to do is pull in some data from the content type that we defined. So we want to say subject. And if we click on that blue link, it will actually just pop it into our box for us. So we'll say subject, let's say comma, and then we'll say by, and then we'll do source.
How did you get the list?
So you see this like a token
Yeah.
set of menus underneath? Toggle down nodes.
Oh, nodes.
And then you see the list of all the fields. You know it's a field that you created if it has this field underscore prefix on it. Things that don't have that field underscore prefix are things that are like Drupal internal.
Where are you?
Alright, so under automatic title generation,
Under which? Under field?
Um,
Fields?
oh, this is under content types quote, just by itself, not manage fields or anything, just content type quote. You click on that,
Okay.
you'll see automatic title generation if you scroll down.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this like token navigator thing.
I still have a message that it's disabled. Oh, so then I automatically generate?
Yeah, so set it to automatically generate the title and hide the title field.
Okay.
And then use this token navigator and toggle down nodes.
Can you source and subject?
Yeah, so we'll say subject, comma, by source. And so this will give us titles like Alexander Hamilton, comma, by George Washington, for a quote by George Washington about Alexander Hamilton. So we'll configure that, and then we will save our content type. Oh, let me back here. All right. So who needs a little bit more time on the automatic title generation?
Installing it.
Oh, okay. I mean, it's not the biggest deal in the world. I mean, again, this is sort of a nice way to placate Drupal with its demand for there being a title for everything, even for content where there really isn't a natural title to
What
it.
if you disable the title?
Disable the title, like,
Oh, I see, that's just automatic generation.
yeah. So by default, it's disabled, and then you enter the title like you type it
Oh, I
manually.
see. Oh, yeah, okay.
What we're saying here is we're going to hide the title field. So once you've configured this, if we go back to, if we click on content and go back to our test quote, suddenly there's no text title field and there's no test quote that you can see here. And so now if we resave it, it will have a new title using the automatic patterns that we set up there.
How did you do that?
Okay, so go, have you configured the automatic
Yeah.
title generation? Then go to content,
So,
and then hit edit for the quote that you created
oh,
earlier.
okay.
Did you create a quote earlier?
Yeah.
Okay, so then hit edit, and then you'll notice
When I
there's
hit save
no
now.
title. Then you hit save, and then poof. All right. So that is the extent of what we'll cover for content types and fields this week. We'll do some data entry together next week. So there's a couple more things that I want to cover quickly in the last 10 minutes. One of them being themes. So this blue Drupal theme is all well and good, and you can, if you go to Appearance Settings, there's a number of options that you can, we'll actually want to go to Appearance Settings Bartik, which is the name of the default theme. And if you do that, you can configure some of the colors around it. If you don't like blue and you prefer red, there's a default around there, and all you have to do is drag this slider around, and it will change the colors. If you click on any of these, drag this around, it'll change the colors. You get a preview of your creation down below. Nice and garish, this particular combination. You can choose to toggle on and off the logo, the site name, main and secondary menus, and so forth. These are all nice configuration options, but still the default theme is somewhat limited. So if you enjoy writing CSS, there are a number of themes out there that support that kind of work. There's a lot of themes that are sort of like scaffolding themes that provide some of the PHP you need to create a theme, some of the Drupal classes, and so forth as part of your template. Things like there's a Zen theme that's good for that, 960 pixels and so forth. Personally, what I tend to do with the themes, because I really hate writing CSS and I hate dealing with themes, is a family called Adaptive Theme. So if we do Drupal Adaptive Theme, we just Google that. Let's install this theme. So this works much like installing modules. You go to the theme, you copy the link, you head back over to your site and go to Appearance, Install New Theme, and then you paste this baby in there and you hit Install. All right, so the nice thing about Adaptive Theme is it provides a really good framework for a number of other themes with a lot of different configuration options. It's a responsive theme out of the box, so it will look nice on smartphones and on tablets. You can configure how it displays things like sidebars for smartphones and tablets. along with defining fonts and defining colors and all of that. By itself, though, it's not a whole lot to look at. So you want one of the adaptive theme sub-themes, which I guess are not actually listed here, but I happen to know off the top of my head. If you search for Drupal Corolla theme, Corolla, that's one of them. And what we want to do is install this theme as well. Appearance.
You have to actually install both.
Yes. So the adaptive theme is basically a prerequisite for Corolla to work right, and we'll look at what this looks like in practice here in a second. If you don't like Corolla, there's also Sky is another option. Let me just write some of these on the board with my pen that works. So of the sub-themes, there's Corolla, Sky, Picture Reloaded. I don't name these things, I don't know. And then AT Commerce. And all of these work the same way. They're sub-themes of adaptive theme, and they give it a sort of a specific look and feel in addition to the framework itself. So to get to this page, just click on Appearance if you're not there already. This will list all of your themes. You've got your enabled themes up here, and your disabled themes down here. So we want AT Core, we want to enable that, but not set it as default. And if we scroll down a little bit more, once we've enabled that, we will enable and set default for Corolla, or Sky, or AT Commerce, or whatnot. Okay, so you've got AT Adaptive Theme Core that you want to enable, and then you have to install an additional theme like Corolla to actually get it to look like much of anything.
And then you enable the.
You enable AT Core, and then you enable and set default for Corolla.
Sorry, could you start after it's been uploaded? Where do you go to?
Okay, so just click on Appearance, and that will give you your list of themes. And if you scroll down, you'll get to your disabled themes, which will include the ones that you just installed.
We don't need to do the AT sub.
No, don't worry about the sub theme or AT admin. So we want to enable AT Core, enable and set default for Corolla. And now what we can do is from here just click on Settings for Corolla. It's next to the theme that you have set default. It's at the top here. We'll hit Settings. And you get all sorts of glorious configuration options, all requiring you to write no CSS. So you can define where the sidebars should be. Should they be on either side, or on the left, or on the right? How wide should your sidebars be? How wide should the page be? Different layouts for tablets and smartphones. Some global settings about how it does responsive layout. You can do some rounded corners. There's some debugging options. There's other extensions like being able to define fonts. So if you scroll down, you can choose what kind of fonts you want for like the header of your site and for the headings of pages and so forth. Image styles, whether things should be aligned to the left or the right or center, whether to show captions. There's just a wealth of options that I encourage you to explore on your own. That all don't require writing any CSS, which is nice. You can also use this to define some colors, which is handy. So, wrapping up here, for between now and next week, if you want to keep working on your site, just explore what you can do with the themes and the different settings in there, and bring any questions if you have them next week. Next week we'll be creating some dummy content out of using our existing content types. We'll be talking about image styles, we'll be talking about date formats, and we'll be getting into the all-powerful views module that will allow you to display your content in a variety of different ways. So that's what I have for you today. If you haven't already filled out a survey, please do so. And yeah, otherwise I will see you next week.